Thank you guys all for joining us today. This is a very exciting program that we are happy to talk about. It is funded by the Josette Robertson and Joan Johnson Foundation, and the goal of it is to empower communities to plant tiny forests within their neighborhoods. I'm sure if you've sought out and came to this webinar that you are likely already pretty passionate about planting trees and planting tiny forests, but we all may have different levels of understanding the why behind why we plant them. Native trees bring diverse native pollinators by providing resources like food and habitat, and by planting native species, we are providing the food source that our pollinators have been using for centuries. In many cases, they have literally adapted their physical features, behavior, and nutritional demands during evolution to be able to access and survive off of the pollen that our native plants produce. Trees take up water from the soil by absorbing runoff and reducing crud prevalence during heavy rain and snowmelt events. They sequester carbon from the atmosphere and offset greenhouse gases. And there are social benefits as well. Tree planting events provide hands-on learning opportunities for people of all ages and all backgrounds. So that what brings us into what makes a tiny forest different. Tiny forests can be planted in small urban spaces using the Miyawaki method, which was named and developed by the Japanese botanist Dr. Akira Miyawaki back in the 1970s. So there are three key features of a tiny forest, and it's kind of important to have all of them together to make it a true tiny forest. So the first is that the soil is amended with things like compost, fertilizer, leaf mulch, coconut coir, for example. Because we are planting in urban spaces, the topsoil has often been stripped away during development, and we're left with mineral soil that is pretty low quality and low in nutrients. So bringing in those amendments brings back the organic matter, brings back those nutrients, and improves the overall texture and capacity to absorb water and all that good stuff. It's also important that we select species that are native to the region and well suited for the site. So I mentioned earlier that our pollinators have adapted to interacting with the native species of the region, but the same goes for plant-to-plant interactions. Our native species have evolved in a way that makes them successfully grow together and make the best use of resources. And finally, in contrast to regular planting, where we may plant a few larger trees 3 meters apart or farther, tiny forests are planted at a density of 2 to 5 plants in 1 square meter. We also plant species of all different types and different mature heights to include flowers, shrubs, and of course those large canopy trees that we're all used to. So this concept is intended to mimic the multiple layers that you would see in a mature forest. So to understand why the Miyawaki method is effective, we need to understand how natural forest succession works on a general level. So let's say we have a big open space that is completely bare, maybe it was cleared out by a wildfire or humans came and logged a previously existing forest. Whatever the reason, if there's little to no plant life left, that means the soil has likely been stripped down in one way or another. The first thing that we would start to see if we were to just leave that space as is the colonization of low-lying species of mosses and small plants that require very little soil to survive. They begin adding organic matter back into the soil through decomposition, and they alter the composition so that there's more available nutrients for other plants. So that will prompt more small plants and eventually shrubs and understory trees to begin colonizing the area, and these plants will grow and stabilize the soil with their roots and continue to add more organic matter back into the soil. And once they have a good system going, larger canopy species will join, which will provide shade and additional habitats for other species of plants, as well as animals and insects. Eventually, the forest will be stable and it will reach peak maturity. In a natural setting, this process can take 100 years or longer. With the Miyawaki method, we essentially skip the first step and cut off at least 25 years of natural succession. So we're bringing in soil amendments to add in those nutrients that the mosses and grasses would typically take their time to create. And instead, we're planting those alongside the shrubs, understory, and canopy trees. So since there's less competition for nutrients in the amended soil, the trees and plants can now immediately begin forming that communication network that they needed to thrive. And the result is that the tiny forests tend to grow faster than a standard planting and can resemble that a mature forest in at least 25 years. This timeline is kind of debated as to whether we can actually see that 100-year forest in 25 years in all climate zones. But regardless, it's pretty understood that it can accelerate the rate that you can get to that mature forest. So that will bring us to our program, Tiny Forests Together. As we have planted more and more of these tiny forests in the National Capital Region, we've planted 13 of them now. We've seen an influx of inquiries from passionate community members who want to plant them in their own neighborhoods. And we obviously see an alignment between that ambition and our own mission. And we wanted to find a way to be able to support the community in planting tiny forests in their neighborhoods while staying within our capacity to meet our overall tree planting goals. And so we developed Tiny Forests Together. The concept behind the program is that we can combine our relevant industry experience and technical skills for planting tiny forests with the ambition, knowledge, and connections of these passionate communities. So we'll form a partnership with interested community groups and we have defined the pieces that each of us will be bringing under this Plant Tiny acronym. So on our end, we will be providing support on project management, which will include creating those project timelines, procurement of materials and trees, and the reporting requirements. We will serve as a link between stakeholders and the community groups because we are an insured and reputable organization in the forestry industry. And we can provide assistance with funding through our own grant applications and support the communities on acquiring other funds through fundraising or their own grant applications. We will supply the native trees and plants, of course, and we will provide training to the communities to ensure that they have the resources that they need to carry out the project. The community groups will be bringing a team of people to plant, which could either be a community association, a volunteer group, a nonprofit organization, or just a group of passionate individuals who want to see a tiny forest happen. They will provide in-kind or financial support, which can be through fundraising or grants, through volunteer time committed to planning or project management, or maybe you just have a friend who owns a greenhouse and wants to donate some of the plants. We are pretty flexible on what that looks like. We mainly just want to see that the community is committed to the project. And they will provide, of course, neighborhood knowledge, maybe on local hotspots, community interests, or areas that are most in need. And maintenance of the tiny forest after it's been planted. So hopefully this concept is pretty straightforward, but as I said, we are pretty flexible on what exactly this relationship will look like, as long as we know that that community is committed to making the project happen. So these are kind of the requirements that we are expecting from a community group that wants to apply for the program. First, they need to have previously demonstrated a commitment to green initiatives. So this can be a small commitment, such as advocacy, to a larger commitment like planting pollinator gardens within the National Capital Region. Ideally, if they are a community association, they have some sort of green team or a committee that also demonstrates that a commitment long-term. But if you are a smaller group of individuals in your community, maybe you can form your own green team, and your attendance at this webinar can be your demonstrated commitment. We are looking for the group to have 2 or 3 dedicated representatives to represent the group. Then we can communicate with them and meet with them to discuss the project throughout its term. We already kind of discussed that in-kind or financial support. Again, that is pretty flexible, but it can be fundraising, grant writing, in-kind time, and of course in-kind materials. And the last item that is needed is time. So we are estimating it will take about 5 to 10 hours a month for the first year of the project, and then 50 to 20 hours per year for the 3-year maintenance period following the planting, which can be split across the community group. So we aren't expecting each community member to be dedicating this much time. It's kind of per community. And these are just a few bonus points that would really make a project stand out. So this would be neighborhoods that have low canopy cover, land access permissions that have already been obtained. You have a working relationship with the landowner or your local city councilor, which can be used as leverage for the project. Or you can demonstrate that the community is in need in some other way. So that could be food insecurity, lack of access to green space, or some other form of inequity. So now that you have an idea of what the program entails, we'll kind of talk about how we will actually plant these tiny forests in the context of this program. So before you can even plant a tiny forest, the first thing that we need is land to plant on. With this program, we're not expecting the community to necessarily have land identified and all of the necessary permissions ready to go when they apply. We are open to working with the community to identify a piece of land and work with the stakeholders to obtain the necessary permissions. However, we recognize that community members have a wealth of knowledge that we don't. You likely know where areas are lacking green space, which ones are most frequented by community members, or are in need of something like an acoustic buffer and things like that. Our only real requirement under the program is that the land has to be publicly accessible. So we will prioritize other factors that demonstrate a strong need, like inequity, that any neighborhood can apply if they agree to having a publicly accessible site. So that can be parks, along trails, or in communal spaces. We do have a positive relationship with the NCC already, so we can exercise that connection. And we are working on building a relationship with the City of Ottawa. So that is also an option that we're open to exploring. And it can be on private land if that land is publicly open and the landowner is willing to sign an agreement stating that people can come and access the site publicly. But we do kind of have a rule where we have to rule out schoolyards since they're often not open to the public in the same way as other sites. But if you do have a schoolyard in mind that you really want to still bring the idea to us, we just may bring the idea to our partners at EnviroCenter who have planted tiny forests and schoolyards with us in the past. With the Miyawaki method, you only need 16 square meters at minimum, but most are anywhere from 75 meters squared. They usually say that a tennis court size of about 200 meters squared is tiny forest, but most of our tiny forests have been under that range. Yeah, so there are other factors at play to consider too, such as the presence of underground utilities or the past or future land use. But we can work with you to figure out whether those sites are logistically plantable and then bring this proposal to the landowner. The overall cost of a tiny forest can be super variable depending on the size and the site conditions. So when you submit your project, we will work with you to determine what and if there are any funding gaps that would need to be filled. If there is a gap, we will support the community groups with closing that gap. We are a registered charity, so we are willing to provide support on grant applications, or we can provide direction on how to fundraise or seek sponsorships if you have connections. Thanks to the Josette Robertson and Jordan Johnson Family Foundation, we do have funding for a select number of community tiny forests this year. And if the program is successful, we'll be seeking external funding again from multiple sources to put toward tiny forests in 2026 and beyond. And the last important piece of the puzzle you need to consider before you plant is probably the easiest piece for us to nail down, and that is the people. So this is kind of the key area where we're hoping that the community will do most of the legwork. The goal is that through your neighborhood connections and associations, you'll be able to get a group together to help with the planning, prepping, planting, and maintaining of the tiny forest. We will get the contractor to do the soil amendments, but we're hoping that there will be a team in place to help with other aspects of site preparation, like installing a fence, for example. Our goal is that the community will feel like they have contributed in all aspects of the project. And of course, we are hoping that the community will agree to maintain the sites for 3 years after planting with our training and our support. So here is the process of creating a tiny forest mapped out for you. We'll start by assessing the soil to determine what kind of amendments it needs, but also we can use the soil type in combination with other observations from the site assessment to determine which species we should plant. We at FCF will draft the plant list in consultation with the community, and we'll do our best to accommodate any specific species requests. Then we prepare the soil by turning over up to 3 feet of the native soil and mixing it with the amendments that I mentioned. If we don't have 3 feet of soil at the site because there just simply isn't that much topsoil, or if we can't dig that deep for whatever reason, we can also supplement with extra topsoil that we bring in as well as the amendments. For a spring planting event, we try to get this part done during the previous fall so that the soil has time to rest. And for a fall planting, we aim for doing this in the spring so that it can rest over summer. Resting time isn't necessary, but it is encouraged so that you can have more time for the soil to sort of decompose, and it just makes a richer soil overall. And of course, probably one of the most exciting parts is when we host the planting day. The events typically will last a couple of hours, and the volunteers will come and plant all of the plants in the tiny forest. We usually set up a grid on the site using string, and we have volunteers grab 1 plant from each layer to plant per square. This just makes it easier for our volunteers to, from our experience, it can be really difficult to eyeball, even if you think it won't. And the last step is the longest step, but probably one of the most important steps, which is maintenance. As we mentioned, for this program, the tiny forest will need to be maintained for at least 3 years after planting day. So we'll provide communities with a detailed maintenance plan of what needs to be done and when and how, but you can expect that it will take an average of 2 to 5 hours per month during the growing season, which is April to October, and that can be, again, split across different community members. Or you could do larger events, have multiple people come in together and kind of make it more of a community and social event. So each tiny forest is unique, and we can kind of customize its design around the specific community need. So some examples of this are to maximize food security. Many of our past sites on community housing properties, we've planted what we've called an edible fringe, which is sort of the outer layer of the forest is planted with edible species so that it's easy to go and harvest those species without having to go all the way into the forest. We can also incorporate cultural or traditional species and exclude poisonous species in plantings where we know that people are going to be eating things. Education is also something we can prioritize. So this could be through having signage identifying what the different plants are, providing a species list to have for the volunteers to bring to the site so they know what they're supposed to weed and what they're not supposed to weed. We could have the names of species presented in a list on planting day. And we could also do a more thorough demonstration and explanation of the tiny forest method on planting day if we think that that's something that people are really going to be interested in. If we know that a community is a very family-driven community with a lot of children, we can also cater the design and planting demonstration toward that. So we can plant species that don't have thorns. We can bring in smaller tools and gloves and plan for a longer planting duration and with a more in-depth demonstration for the younger audiences. If we're working with a pollinator-savvy community, or if we're near community gardens or other natural space that would really benefit from having extra pollinators, We can also target species selection around pollinator diversity, and we could even consider doing the equivalent of an edible fringe, but with a wildflower fringe if we wanted to. And something we get asked a lot is whether people can enter the tiny forests. And the answer is yes, but there is some downsides to designing a tiny forest around having an entry point. From an environmental standpoint, allowing people to enter the forest and walk on the soil will increase compaction, as well as the smaller plants being squished when they are small and young. And it's also an invitation for people to enter and loiter in the forest, which tends to put a risk on individual safety and, again, damage being caused to the forest. I think this question often stems from the fact that a lot of the ways that we are used to interacting with nature is by physically immersing ourselves in it. We walk on groomed trails through managed parks, we swim in water, we harvest food. So with that, I just encourage you to reflect on whether you really need to be in the forest to be connected with it, and remind you that you can enter the forest to learn about how to maintain and care for it, and that symbiotic relationship may be the way that you interact with it. With that being said, we can create an access path within a tiny forest using mulch or decorative stone and not planting in that area if we think that it really would be useful or novel. For example, our demonstration plots at our base of operations have entry points to allow for sampling, for research purposes, as well as to be used as sort of an outdoor learning space. So it is possible to make it accessible, but my point here is to kind of consider whether every tiny forest really needs to be. So if you weren't already convinced about planting a tiny forest, let's talk about why you may want to choose a tiny forest over a regular planting. So first up, the tiny forests grow faster than standard plantings in typical situations. So they can grow at least 30% times faster than conventional plantings. And you can see in these pictures alone, the difference in a standard planting is pretty minimal. It kind of depends on the year of how much water we get and how much drought there is. But generally speaking, tiny forests thrive better in those conditions as well. So they just end up growing faster regardless. The second one, which is probably my favorite point, is that they are less maintenance. One thing that we always get asked when we talk about tiny forests is how much maintenance they are. And I think they are often comparing these to sort of a smaller garden bed instead of compared to a standard tree planting. But if you look at these pictures, I think they kind of speak for themselves about how much easier it is to maintain a tiny forest. So with a standard planting, this is at one of our oldest sites. It requires pretty much bi-weekly site visits to remove competing vegetation around all of the trees. There are hundreds of trees planted at this site, but there are also hundreds of trees planted at this site. It's also really difficult to water during those heat events because the site is just so sprawled out. So you need to kind of carry the water far, and like most plantings don't have access to a hose. Versus a tiny forest, the site is all condensed into a small forest. It's easy to know where the boundaries are of where you're supposed to weed. It's easy to water, and a lot of them are planted within access to a hose. But even if they aren't, you don't have to walk as far with it because they are in a smaller space. So these estimates of maintenance hours are actually taken from our sites. So we track how much time we spend on a site each year. And so this site took 24 hours of maintenance last year, and this site took an average of 10. And of course, the real benefit here is that they are tiny. You can squeeze in a lot more plants into a smaller space when you are planting at this density and all those multiple layers at one time. So these are just some numbers that we've taken from our standard planting sites. on average, you have less than a tree per square meter, less than 0.2 trees per square meter in a standard planting. But with tiny forests, we are looking at 3 to 4 on average at our sites. So yeah, you are really maximizing all of those ecosystem services that you can get from having this many trees in one space. And another question we get a lot is how the survival rates compare between standard plantings and tiny forests. We haven't actually taken our own data yet at tiny forests to compare the survival rate, but we are hoping to this year. But we have taken our survival rates at our standard plantings, and we're at an average of 75%. We are looking at this number. This number is from like our early years of maintenance. So we are seeing an increase in this number, and we strive for an 85% survival rate. But on average, this is what we have been seeing with what we've been doing. And other research sources have looked into the survival rate of tiny forests. And this is actually pretty low for what most of them are reporting, of an average of 79%. Some research has reported up to a 90% survival rate. So I would say either way, it's not really a concern that the survival of these trees are going to be any lower just because they grow faster. And this is just to kind of set the expectation that tiny forests are not manicured gardens and they aren't going to look like one. I think everyone has an image in their mind of what a tiny forest might look like. So this is just a disclaimer that they may not look like the planted spaces that you're used to seeing. They are intended to be wild and natural spaces, and they provide ecological and social services. So they are powerful and they are beautiful, but they are wild spaces. And I think that if you aren't used to seeing that, it might be a bit of a shock at first, but they really are beautiful in their own way. And they aren't meant to be unruly either. Speaking of those ecological and social services, if we go back to the reasoning for planting trees in urban spaces that we talked about at the start, we can see that tiny forests actually emphasize all of the benefits of planting trees. So there are native species that live in every layer of a natural forest. So when we choose to incorporate multi-layered plantings in urban spaces, we are accommodating a more biodiverse subset of pollinators and wildlife. By adding in those soil amendments, we are improving the soil structure and ability to absorb runoff. You can see in this photo here that the snow and ice on the tiny forest has all melted, but the surrounding area is still frozen. And this is because of two main reasons. The first being that the mulch layer on the forest increases the heat and insulation, which allows the snow to melt faster. And the second being that the snow melt can be absorbed by the soil instead of just sitting on top and becoming frozen again when temperatures drop at nightfall and melting and freezing and melting over and over again until eventually it's dry enough for the snow to get through. Since tiny forests grow faster than a standard planting, they also start to sequester carbon sooner and at a faster rate. So some early studies have suggested that the fast growth rate and soil amendments associated with tiny forests have resulted in a 30% or more greater carbon sequestration overall. And finally, this kind of novel and exciting type of planting event will typically bring a higher community turnout to plantings. They also get to view it as an educational experience, which will bring in a more diverse audience as well. And they get to sort of watch that forest grow together at a faster rate. So you aren't just sitting around waiting for that little tree to grow, you're waiting for an entire ecosystem to grow and watching how it sort of starts to develop and all the species grow together, which can be a lot more rewarding and a lot stronger of a learning experience. So now we're just going to do the recap and the next steps. So a tiny forest is planted using methodology developed by Dr. Akira Miyawaki in the 1970s, which includes soil amendments and densely planted native species. They are popular in urban neighborhoods because they take up less space, they grow faster, and require less maintenance than a standard tree planting. And we are inviting passionate community groups to submit applications to our Tiny Forest Together program for plantings in 2025 and 2026. And I just wanted to draw attention to the photos here. This was our largest tiny forest we've planted yet in Pocajauquete in Gatineau. We planted it last spring with the National Capital Commission. And these are just some photos of it throughout the year. So you can see even between May and October how fast these spaces can grow. And the next steps. So if you are interested in this Tiny Forest program, the first thing that you're going to want to do is determine your TINY. So with your community group, you're going to want to identify who your team leads are, the level of support that you have available or what type of support, any land or target areas that you may have in mind, and ensure that you are committed to those 3 years of maintenance. Then you'll want to submit an application. If you go to this link, which is our website /PlantTiny, that it's under construction, but the form will be available within the next 2 weeks for community members to be able to submit their application. And we will send an email to everybody who is registered to this webinar, letting them know when it is open. Our preferred deadline for 2025 is April 22nd. And for a 2026 planting, we're aiming 31st. So just the end of fall, so that we have time to sort of plan for next year.